Good day, everyone. I'd like to formally welcome you to Paradigm Shift, TradeShift's first virtual event experience. We appreciate you taking the time this morning, whether it be with your morning coffee or your end of the week mid-glass wine. I'm Christy Kaler, and I lead the Global Partner Marketing Program here at TradeShift. It's great to see so many familiar names register, and I'm truly looking forward to virtually connecting with you during the series. Over the next 5 weeks, we'll be discussing this new path we're on, how we can navigate that together, and this new normal, and what we thought was the future of business is actually here now. The way we do business has changed, the way we interact and work has changed, and like me, I'm sure many of you are juggling your new environments, maybe with a few boys nagging you for a couple of things while you're trying to Zoom meeting, do a report, and be a part-time teacher. What will you experience during the Paradigm Shift program? We're going to have keynote speakers, panel sections, and interactive workshops to find some answers together, look at that new path forward, and discover the opportunities available. And in true TradeShift fashion, we're going to have a few tricks up our sleeve. So one of those tricks, if you'll notice on your screen right now, we have the extremely talented graphic recorder Jai capturing the event. Jai joins us from SketchFX, and you're going to be in awe at how he summarizes the session. As we wrap up at the end of the hour, you're going to see Jai's visual recap, and I promise you will be amazed. Just a few housekeeping notes before we start. As this probably isn't your first virtual event experience, as we say here at TradeShift, shift happens. So if in fact shift does happen, we will be right back, so please sit tight. Last but not least, as we announced this morning in your reminder, we will be running a little scavenger hunt during the program. So you'll find all of the details that you need on the registration page. It's a great way for all of us to have some fun, be a bit more interactive, and for any of you that have a competitive nature, if you submit the form by June the 5th, you'll be entered into a raffle for some prizes. So pay attention to the sessions, you'll get some clues there. So I'm going to kick off, let us dive right into the program. And I'd like to introduce our keynote speakers. First, we have our fearless leader, CEO, and co-founder, Christian Lang. If any of you have had the pleasure of seeing Christian speak before, you know his message will be very insightful, engaging, and relevant. Following Christian, we're going to have our special guest keynote, who we're all very, very excited about, Kelly Leonard, who's the executive director of Second City and the esteemed improv theater based in Chicago, which is the birthplace of many global acting superstars such as Steve Carell and Tina Fey, to name a few. If you're thinking, how does that apply to global trade? Well, you're gonna have to stick around to find out. But just know that Kelly has been applying the comedic timing lessons he's learned to the world of business to critical acclaim, including his celebrated book that he's authored, Yes and. So let's move forward, and I'll kick it off with Christian Lang. Thanks, everybody, enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Christy, for that wonderful introduction. And obviously really excited about all of the amazing sessions we put together. I, like everyone else, as Christy said, has been working from home, part-time teacher, and juggling everything else. But I also think a situation like this is an absolute massive opportunity to think about how things are changing. And when we picked the name Paradigm Shift, we didn't do it just on random or because we thought it sounded cool, but really because we saw that the moment that we're in right now is an opportunity for much broader change than might be evident on the surface of things. I'm a sociologist as background, and in sociology and in scientific method, there's a very important person called Thomas Kuhn, and he had a very important insight around 100 years ago, which was that paradigm shifts arise when the dominant paradigm under which normal science operate is rendered incompatible with new phenomenon, facilitating the adoption of new theory of a paradigm. And while this might be a little wordy or a little sciencey for a lot of you, I think it's actually pretty simple, which is, paradigm shifts are mindset changes, and his observation were the changes in mindset about what represents our world happen in big waves rather than linearly. We might think that the future is coming at us just sort of in a constant march, but what actually is the reality is it comes in massive waves that change everything. And we've had a few waves since the Second World War that changed our world, I think, over and over, not least the internet. But the reality might be that is probably maybe only the tip of the iceberg. So very often it's not really technology, it's not really science that's holding us back from changing what we're capable of. It's the mindset, and we need something to prompt and challenge our existing mindsets. And I think for all of us, this year, 2020 has been one of mindset change. And to give an example of how quickly things have been happening and how quickly they've been changing. In January 2020, COVID-19 was sort of formally discovered. Maybe there were strains that was found a little earlier, but that was sort of the formal timeline where people started talking about COVID-19 as a thing in China. In February, most leaders in the Western world calmed us down and said this is not going to be a big issue for the West. It seems China have it under control. This is a local issue in China. In March, the UK was 3 weeks away from running out of aspirin, as people who have learned that ibuprofen and similar medicines didn't really work or were dangerous to take if there was COVID-19, were doing a run on it. And actually the pharmaceutical supply chains come under very great strain in most part of the world just to keep up with demand. And then in April, suddenly most Western nations have problems sourcing enough $1 masks. We're not talking about computer chips. We're not talking about fiber optic cables. We're not talking about quantum computers. No, we're talking about, rectangular pieces of cloth that is sewed together, pretty much automated in most parts of the world, and we can't get it. So for all of our advanced infrastructure, technology, supply chains, logistics, something as simple as a mask is bringing most of the Western world to its knees when it comes to sourcing. In April, EU also declares that the car industry might never return to normal. We might need to use a program to scrap old cars just to buy new ones, and most of those new cars, if bought, might be electric. And then in early May, as we in ongoing discussion with most of our customers, they decide to completely remove paper from the business processes. And that's been a major theme from almost all of our customers. They had a very challenging time operating business processes based on paper. As employees were not coming into offices, there was nobody to go open an envelope, put it in the scanner, process a PDF, type it. So essentially a lot of business processes would come to a grinding halt in March and April. And now there was this massive push, still is, towards getting to digital a lot faster. And then finally, just this week, Twitter decided that working from home will be a permanent option in the future. In fact, working from home will be the default option, and going to the office will be optional, right? So in a span of 4 months, we have moved to challenge a lot of concepts that have been completely, I would say, business beliefs for the last 30 or 40 years, right? That we need to go to an office to work, that's how you work. Yes, of course, there's been fringe tech companies, there's been work from home options, there's been flexibility, but as a default mode, it's not something we ever experienced on the scale that we're doing right now. The same with paper. We, I think, have been going through what we think as digitalization for the last 20 years. Everybody has been saying digital transformation over and over. But yet, most of the world came to a grinding halt, at least the business world, because of paper in March and April. And it was, I think, very clear that we were very, very far away from this digital future. So what happens when we start changing beliefs and when we start challenging beliefs, right? And why do this kind of changes? Why do they happen in waves? And I think human nature is a peculiar thing that I'm betting that Kelly, he'll probably talk a lot more about improvisation and how we change and how we can think. But I think, one of the most important things here is really that when we are forced to change one belief, we are free to question all other beliefs, right? So I think we all know somebody who've gone through a transformation. They used to believe one thing, and at some point in their life, they challenged that one thing that they grew up to believe, right? As kids, it's probably Santa Claus. For other people later in life, it might be different things. For some people, it is turning off meat, becoming vegetarian. We have all of these moments in our life where we challenge a belief that we held very dearly. And when we do, it kind of frees us up to question a lot of things. It frees us up to change. And what's interesting, I think, is it's rare that the first change is one we choose. It's very rare that we go one day, wake up one morning and say, hey, I want to completely change all of my beliefs. It's typically that we are forced to change the first belief. It might be because of lifestyle choices. It might be because as kids, we realize that, believing in Santa in high school is just not as cool. So there's this forced change of the initial belief. And that is what frees us up to challenge all the other beliefs. And I think we can think a little bit about it as we're pulling the thread in a sweater. The whole thing becomes unraveled. And what I spend a lot of time thinking about over the last few weeks is really, what does the change of beliefs look like that we're going to experience in business as sort of COVID-19 and the global pandemic has yanked the first thread in the sweater. And we've been talking about transformation and change, I think, ever since we founded Tradeshift. We have one very strong belief in Tradeshift, which is a connection, a true connection between people, between companies, is transformational. But we've had a hard time sometimes getting through with that message. And I think as we're pulling that sweater, I want to talk a little bit about how actually, as you start looking at this transformation happening right now, there's a massive opportunity in front of us, but we got to be able to see it, and we're going to be able to challenge a lot of our existing beliefs. And luckily, we have the opportunity. The question is if we're going to take it. So what are the ideas that are taken for granted in business that we're now free to change? Just to look at a few. The first one is what I would call fake digitalization. As I said, for the last 15 years, we've been saying digital transformation over and over. But the reality is we haven't really digitized our business processes. We've put a pretty digital front end on very manual and very complex backends. So just imagine that you were about to send a message to one of your friends using your favorite chat application, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, maybe even something as anachronistically as an email. We have an expectation that happens seamlessly, instantly, with a lot of actually context. We can see if it's been read, we can reply, we can collaborate. It all happens like this. Now think about sending a purchase order to one of your suppliers. While on your screen, it's a completely digital process. You're opening up your application, you're clicking a button, you're filling out what you want to order, and you click send. What typically happens is that purchase order is at that point converted to a PDF, throwing out 50% of the information that you just put into it. It is then forwarded, if you're lucky, over email. If you're unlucky, it's printed and put in an envelope. It's sent to the other business partner, where it's typically printed, put into a scanner. We again strip out around 50% of the information. Somebody on the other side then types in whatever is missing from the scanning or conversion process. And finally, the recipient is looking at this PO in their digital software and thinking about it as a digital experience. In between, this is taking anywhere from a week to 4 weeks to happen. 50% of the information is lost. The next thing that typically happens is that the person who's receiving this has to call the other side and say, hey, I don't understand, something is missing. That person says, well, it's all on my screen, because they're not really aware that this fake digitalization that's happened in between has stripped out most of the information. And in many ways, I think the way we have thought about digitalization in the 2000s is like kabuki theater. It looks real. All of the buttons work if you push them, but underneath there's a massive complex machine of paper and manual processes and human touching stuff. And I think COVID-19 has in many ways been the great revealer, right? Because the moment we take those humans out of the equation, it stops. But my email didn't stop working. My WhatsApp didn't stop working. So it's clear that we have all of the technology to communicate seamlessly. It's just we've chosen not to use it in business, right? And if we go a little further into to that, right? The next big thing is the office optional. In Tradeshift, we have also decided that the future of work, it's not that we're going to prevent people from going to offices. We'll have offices everywhere where people need them, but it will be optional. It's something you can do if that fits your work style, if it fits the team's work style, if it's something you want to do. But it's not something we're going to require of people. And I think, what do that really truly mean? How many people will choose this option, not just as we make it available on Twitter, but as everybody else follows, right? And I think this is truly something where everybody else will follow, or as many companies as possible. What will it mean for our work patterns, for collaboration? We already seen an explosion in collaborative apps like Zoom, like Slack, everything around it. But I think that shift is going to be much more profound than people realize. And then sort of the second part of why people might choose to work from home over the office, right? So this is a picture of the standard San Francisco commute on a standard workday. Average time between San Jose and San Francisco in the morning is somewhere between 1.5 hours to 2 hours. And when it's not rush hour, it's around 35 minutes. So how much of our life are we spending in these metal contraptions, moving back and forth between a workspace that at this point probably is more symbolic that it's really a big value add. It's not like we have big manufacturing equipment for a lot of jobs that we need to get into. With cloud, it's not like there's a lot of computers in the office that we can't access from home. So as we're learning to become really good at interactions through Zoom, through other platforms, as we're learning to connect in other ways, the question is really how many people will take the tax that is the daily commute when they don't have to. And that again, obviously have sort of some follow effects. What will that mean for the car industry? I mean, the main reason that most people that are not in a frontline job or in service job, that they have at least 2 cars, is that they need to get to the office. And if they have 2 jobs, they need to have 2 cars so they both can get to the office. So I think an acceleration of what we've already seen over the last 10, 15 years, it used to be that getting a car was an American teenager's number one wish before 1990. You know, in the 2000s and in 2015, 20s, that became an iPhone instead of a car, because with an iPhone, you can get an Uber app, and with an Uber app, you can get mobility. And I think that trend, we will also see massively accelerated over the coming years with big impacts on car industry, mobility, and how we think about simple stuff like commute. That is a daily activity, right? Cities versus suburbs. A lot of us are in the city because we don't want to commute. We prefer to be close to work. And I think as, you know, office become optional, we also are going to rethink where we live, why we live, what is life quality. Do we really want to live in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment when we could have a big house in the suburbs, maybe have some garden, have some you know, views, etc. Right? So there's going to be a massive shift in city living versus suburb living, and I think we're going to invent many new kind of suburbs. So this, of course, is the traditional white boxes that a lot of us know, but that's probably not the only model that's going to exist. I think there are going to be many different kind of suburban communities growing out of this as we switch our work patterns and as we switch our commuting patterns. And I think that's again going to affect consumer behaviors. It's going to affect what we're buying when we consider value. You know, rather than having massive networks of people that we're seeing on a daily basis, meeting at social spots like bars, cinemas, restaurants, we might have closer, smaller circles that we are seeing at home, that we're entertaining, that we're hosting. So again, also big changes in consumer patterns, as we, in some ways, I think, might become more grounded versus much more mobile in society as a whole. Logistics. We are constantly shipping stuff around the globe. In fact, the largest cost for most goods manufactured in China today, the largest component of cost, when we look at margin, is very often logistics. It's the act of moving the parts. And I think what we're seeing right now is going to be an acceleration of that. There's the whole discussion of country of origin. Country of origin very often means that it has been assembled in the last step has been assembled in the country where it's sold. So country of origin, expect to see made in America, made in Germany, made in France, made in Denmark, made in China, a lot more goods when they're sold in those markets. What that really might mean is they've been assembled in those markets. But there's also another trend going on, which is we have operated with a supply chain concept for the last 30 years called just-in-time logistics. We're essentially pushing goods and services just in time to where they're needed with very little inventory. And I think, what is going to change here is that we're going to see a lot more local manufacturing. I don't think it's going to be reshoring, meaning moving less manufacturing in some hubs, but really much more distributed manufacturing. We're going to have a high degree of automated manufacturing, and I think that's going to be the next big change. And you can really argue if it's a good model to have extremely fragile, fast-long supply chains with just-in-time components. That works great in a world where there's no change, when everything is stable, when we can predict the future 10, 15 years out, we can invest in the supply chain. But suddenly, I think, as a lot of people became aware during COVID-19, when we can't get aspirin in the UK, when we can't get masks in the US, we're going to start asking ourselves, what would have been the cost of buying, let's say, 10% more masks and having them stockpiled in a warehouse? What would we have cost of having, let's say, instead of 3 weeks of aspirin, 3 months of aspirin? And the answer in most cases would be far less than what we're paying right now to source it, right? So I think, we're going to see a pivot from what I would say just-in-time logistics to just-in-case logistics, where we are much more prepared for the unknown. And this is something I think where computing and cloud computing will actually really, truly impact this space a lot. If, as a cloud computing operator, if we build our infrastructure in such a way that one server fell over, nobody had global access to our service, our customers wouldn't be very happy. So we are expected to build in redundancy. We expected to design a distributed production, all of these things. And I think a lot of those concepts will start applying in logistics and supply chains as well. We need to sort of rethink how we're doing this. Then there's the whole question about what is a job? If we're working from home, if we're virtual, if we're locking into the office, why have one job? Could we have more jobs? Could we apply our skill set across a wider set of companies? How many jobs are truly dealing with confidential IP stuff that we can't share between companies? Is what we've seen from Instacart and Uber as sort of dynamic job platforms, is that going to happen to white collar jobs too? And how many jobs will I be allowed to have a lot more flexibility, check in, check out, as we sort of transition and offices become optional, commute becomes optional, virtual access to our colleagues and virtual access to our customers becomes the norm. And I think there's going to be a massive revolution around how we view jobs, how we think about a job, how we think about an employer, and how many jobs we have. And then as we look at production, I was talking with one of our customers about how they saw their manufacturing shift. And as I talked a little bit about on the logistics and on the supply chain, just for cost reasons, just for inventory reasons, we are going to see a switch. But I was saying to someone, well, maybe that also means a lot of jobs will move. And their view was maybe not in the way you expect. What if the factory is in the US, but it's robotics? And what if the complex tasks that a robot can do is remotely operated by a service operator from India? We can already, fly drones into war with people sitting in Las Vegas. Why can't we operate an industrial robot from India rather than US? So I think we might see the distribution move, but what we are also going to see at the same time is that access and delivery of those services will also be completely virtualized. We can work from many different places, even in jobs that we couldn't before. And I think that's probably the last big wave, right? In many ways, the container created the 21st century. It was essentially in 20th, like large degree, right? But it was essentially the reason for the massive change that globalization has brought to the world. It created a global world. It started with containers going to Vietnam to support the war efforts there at that time. And then it brought back goods from Japan to the US. And that essentially sort of kickstarted globalization as we know it today, and shipping goods all over the world. And I'm wondering if services like Zoom and translation, like Google Translate and similar services, which are now pretty much real time. You can actually plug in real-time translation to Zoom. As I'm speaking here, we could be translating to a lot of different languages. It could be subtitled. And I wonder if not Zoom and virtual translation is the container for services, and are going to do the same to services as physical containers did to physical goods, meaning making it possible to deliver them from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world. At Tradeshift, I already told our services team that we should immediately think about our service delivery in the future as a virtual service delivery. All of our customers are right now being trained to receive services virtually. So we should, rather than sort of temporarily try to deliver virtually and then hold our breath for the world to return to normal, we should instead expect the world to want virtual service delivery as the norm in the future, and get there faster and be better than anyone. So I think as we're thinking about these profound things, right, the main question really is, our thought is, we can't decide when a revolution happens, but we can be conscious about how we ride the wave. We had no choice in COVID-19 happening or not. It happened to us. There's no way around it. But as it's happening, we're already seeing in 4 months more change when it comes to digitalization than we probably have the last 10 years. Work from home, Zoom, moving to digital. But I think if we think those are the changes, if we think, oh, remember COVID-19, it was when we started Zooming, then I think we're thinking very, very narrowly. No, COVID-19 might be when we truly started deploying the digital platforms we've been developing over the last 20 years to all aspects of our lives to transform how we live, how we work, how we go to work, how we think about manufacturing, production, green energy, and so on. And the goal that we have with Paradigm Shift over the next 5 weeks is really just to ask that question in as many ways as we can. How is the world going to change? And I think that's also why the next speaker, Kelly Leonard, is such a great choice, because what he deals with, and I think what he's been working with for now his whole life essentially, is how improvisation drives change, right? And how being able to think on your feet is an absolute critical, not just business skill, but life skill. So Kelly, I will hand it over to you, and hopefully you can take it from there.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, absolutely. You know, the everything you're talking about, the futurists have been saying is going to happen. And if you look at like the future of work skills at the World Economic Forum, they have things like innovation, creativity, storytelling, problem solving, divergent thinking, the trickiest human stuff. So really what I'm going to talk to you today is about my field of improvisation, and how that is a practice in all of this. So just to start, a thing we're doing is we're always checking in now. I am sheltering in place at my home in the northwest side of Chicago. So if you hear barking, that's my 100-pound Bernese Mountain Dog, Benchley. But I started working at Second City in 1988. It was my first gig out of college, and I started as a dishwasher. This is not as romantic as it might sound. The back bar in those days was filled with alcoholics and sociopaths, and I'm not making that up. But the other guy who got hired to wash dishes with me was Jon Favreau, the now famous film director. So I don't know if you know how Second City is set up, but we do 2 acts of scripted content and then a 3rd act that is improvised, and that's where the actors just sort of making it up as they go. And so on stage at that point, on the resident stages were Bonnie Hunt and Mike Myers and Jane Lynch. Chris Farley had just been hired in the touring company and was constantly getting in trouble for breaking stuff. Tim Meadows had been hired in as well. And the thing about these improv sets is they felt like magic. But it didn't take me too long after working there a bit to realize it wasn't magic at all. It's an actual practice. So I'm not going to bury the lead. Improvisation is yoga for your social skills. Improvisation is loud, noisy group mindfulness. Improvisation is a practice in being unpracticed, working without a script, which is what every one of us is having to do right now. So if that surprises you, it maybe wouldn't if you knew the origin story of the Second City and these improv exercises. So there was a woman by the name of Viola Spolin who was working at Jane Addams Hull House in the 20s and 30s on the south side of Chicago. And her job was to better assimilate the immigrant children who were coming into her care. So she invented all these improv games that the kids would play to come together, to empathize, to communicate, to collaborate. And many of these exercises were in gibberish or in silent, they were silent because the kids didn't always share language. Her son, Paul Sills, was studying at the University of Chicago at that time. He loved these games, so he taught them to his friends, Mike Nichols and Elaine May, among others. They go on to form the first improvisational theater in America, the Compass Players, in 1957. That then turns into the Second City in 1959. So many of these exercises are just very simple, but they're important because they deal with things like self-regulation. And I'm going to get into some of the science later, but let me explain one of these games. There's a very simple game called Red Ball. And what you do is a group of people gather in a circle, and the instructor holds up an imaginary red ball. That instructor makes eye contact with someone in the circle, and they say, "Red ball," and they throw the imaginary ball to the person. The person receiving catches the imaginary ball and says, "Thank you, red ball," turns, finds someone else and says red ball and throws it to them. And that keeps going on throughout the circle. This may seem really, really simple. It's not, it's kind of hard for people to get used to. And when we add other balls, we'll add a blue ball or a green ball, we'll add a baby, you know, so it can make it very chaotic. But what we're doing is we're simulating communication. And we figure out the various ways that we send out our messages and the various ways we can receive our messages. And it's more than words. It's eye contact, it's body language, it's distribution of our communications so we don't just keep throwing the red ball to the same person, because that's the easier thing to do. And I think this is simple, but it's also profound. So I started producing The Second City in 1992, and my first cast included Steve Carell, Stephen Colbert, and Amy Sedaris. I hired Tina Fey and Amy Poehler and produced a show with Seth Meyers. The 90s were a magic time at The Second City. But fast forward to 2015, and I had stepped down from my producing role, and I was looking for new projects. And I had this idea around facilitating and creating an improv workshop with a negotiation angle to it. Because I was reading a lot of business books that were talking about how the art of negotiation is like an act of improvisation, but no one was getting deeper in it. So I literally Googled academic negotiation, Chicago universities, and 5 professors came up. I emailed all of them. 4 of them got back to me within a week, and everyone was really eager. A couple weeks had gone by, and the 5th professor finally got back to me, Eugene Caruso from the University of Chicago, and said, "Sorry I didn't get back to you, but do you still want to meet?" And old Kelly would have been like, "No, I'm good with this," but I was on my sort of Shonda Rhimes year of yes bullshit. And so I said, sure. And I went to the University of Chicago. He invited his wife, Heather, because he thought that she might be interested. And so I go into their office and I start doing sort of my rap on improvisation. And Eugene could care less. He's checking email, but Heather is dialed in. And after I finish, Heather says, "Kelly, we're behavioral scientists. We have decades and decades of research that show that people make bad decisions for themselves. What you're talking about is an art form that can give them practice in making better decisions for themselves." And I left this meeting on air, and within about a month or so, we announced the formation of the Second Science Project. And this is a collaboration that we've been doing at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago for the last 4 years. We look at behavioral science through the lens of improvisation, and we look at improvisation through the lens of behavioral science. So most of what I'm going to talk to you about today is evidence-based research that either we've done or we're drawing on other research to inform the kind of training and learning that we talk about in our work. Okay, so I want to take a moment and explain the difference between improv and comedy, because this comes up a lot in my talks. We use improvisation as a method for producing comedy that is grounded in truth and pain and distance. That's a formula that my colleague Ann Libra created as a professor of comedy at Columbia College. She started the first ever BA in comedy writing and performance. She is also my wife, and I was smart enough to marry someone smarter than me. So I'm mostly talking about improvisation today, but I did want you to experience some comedy while we're together. When we started talking about having me join you for this paradigm shift, I immediately thought of a Second City show I produced in 1997 called Paradigm Lost. This scene, which we're going to show you, is jokingly titled Yes and, because it's the opposite of what yes and is. And I'll talk to you more after we see the clip. So we can go ahead and roll that clip.
Professor Fay.
Yes.
Hi, Professor Adson. The ethics department.
Oh, Professor Adson, hello.
We've met before, haven't we?
No, we haven't.
No, we haven't.
Well, I'm really looking forward to working on this paper.
Oh, me
with
too,
you.
me too.
Please put your things anywhere. Have a seat. Let me just finish up what I'm doing here, and then we'll go
All
have
right.
some coffee or something. I'll just be a minute. Oh.
Student paper?
Mm-hmm.
What's the subject?
Kevorkian.
Oh, Kevorkian. What a monster. He should be put away forever, don't you think?
Oh, you don't like Kevorkian?
Oh, horrible man. Murderer.
Well, I think the jury nullification in his cases indicates there's a gray area there.
Really?
Yes, I think there's an ethical question being posed that our current laws don't account for. I mean, have you seen these people that he assists? Their bodies are ravaged by pain, but their minds are completely lucid.
Well, they're in terrible pain, obviously, but these people are at the end of their lives. They don't want some stranger coming in and sitting at their bedside and telling them whether they should live or die.
No, they want to make that decision themselves.
Exactly, that's my point. They should be allowed to make that decision. If they want to die, they should be allowed to die. And I'm just glad there's someone like Kevorkian who's willing to do it. God bless him, I'm just surprised he even went to trial.
We actually agree.
No, I support Kevorkian. You know, these people are losing their mind. They can make that decision for themselves. It's not like a fetus in a womb. You can't make that decision about life and death.
Abortion is a tricky issue.
Oh, it's not tricky at all. It's just wrong across the board.
Well, most groups acknowledge that in the cases of rape or incest...
Oh, special cases,
or
yes, rape, incest, economic troubles. But my passionate belief is no one should be allowed to go in there and tell a woman what to do with what is essentially hers. I mean, that's a woman's body.
Yes.
I mean, that's her body.
Yes,
Right?
You're not against abortion.
No, I just don't think it should be mandatory. It's really wrong for the government to go in there and tell us what to do with every aspect of our lives. I mean, affirmative action, telling us who to hire and who not to hire, it's ridiculous. Private industry means private industry.
Well, as a woman, I've benefited greatly from
Well,
affirmative
not really
action.
talking about women
I
here.
just wish that another group, for example, black men, could have benefited.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I'm just going to stop you there. Black men have been treated terribly in this country. And I think there should be some kind of government program set up whereby black men have the same opportunities for employment as a white man. I mean, you must see that.
Yes.
You must concede that point.
Of course I do.
Well, I'm glad I convinced you.
I don't think this collaboration is going to work out between the two of us.
Why do you say that?
I don't think we see eye to eye on a lot of these issues.
Really?
No, we don't agree.
Well, I'd have to say we disagree. I don't think this is going to work out. Well, I'm sorry. What a terrible waste of time this has been.
No, it's not a waste
What a
of time.
colossal
It's
waste
only
of
been a
time.
few minutes.
It's been fairly productive.
It's always a pleasure to speak to someone so forthright with such deep convictions and strong point of view.
Well, I would have to say the same thing.
Yes, I thought you might.
So that's obviously Tina Fey and Scott Adsit when they were at Second City, and Tina had that terrible haircut. She hates it when I play that clip. And we called that scene Yes and because these people are not yes anding. So here's the idea, central idea around yes and. It's the stickiest of improv concepts. When groups of people are getting together making something out of nothing, you get nowhere by saying no. And you actually don't get that far by just saying yes. You have to say yes and. You have to affirm and contribute in order to explore and heighten. And we use this at Second City as an introduction, as a beginning, as a start to anything we're doing. If it's an artistic pursuit, if it's in the office, the first 5 minutes sometimes, if not the first 5 days, are an act of yes and. Because what we have found over time is that no original or innovative idea came out of something sort of like normal. It's crazy ideas, the things that you think can't happen. That's what yes and pushes you to. So I do these talks all the time, and there's always a guy in the back in a suit, and it's always a guy who says, if I yes anded every idea that came in my office, I'd get no work done. Two things I know. One, that guy is terrible to work with. And two, he's misunderstanding the concept, because yes and operates at the front end of innovation. It's the beginning of a brainstorm. It's at the start of a creative process. There is plenty of no to happen later. But when you enter into a space, and it's this idea around a growth mindset, right? It's the opposite of a fixed mindset. You want someone to come in and be willing to exchange ideas and build upon things and learn new things. We have a phrase in our work, bring a brick, not a cathedral. Too many people walk in with their cathedrals, and this is what's happening right now in the universe, that the world we live in right now is turned upside down, and people are desperately trying to turn it back into what it was, and it will never be that. We are all improvisers right now. This is crucial when a crisis experiences, because what happens is we start working out of fear. And when we're working out of fear, we're going to move to our fight, flight, freeze, or fawn brain, all of which reduce our ability to absorb information, make good decisions, and be creative. I was talking to the psychologist, Dr. Marie Serra, about her idea is, she uses this analogy of the swamp and the pond. So bad things and good things are always coexisting in the world. We have a tendency as human beings to go to the swamp, to go to the bad things, but the pond is there as well. And she's like, you've got to remember that and try to shift yourself and your mindset to recognize that there's also a pond. We were creating a virtual resilience workshop, and we were adapting some of our exercises. And my wife actually came up with one that we inserted right away. And this is something I think you can do with your teams and just for yourself as well. So you take a piece of paper and you write down something you wish you could do right now that you can't. So for me, it was like swim in salt water, swim in the ocean. That is something I really want to do. And I said, okay, now write down the emotion you think that you would get from that experience. So for me, it was like, I would feel so refreshed. That was the thing. So swim in the ocean, refreshed. Now, third, write down a thing that you could do right now where you are to experience that emotion. Okay, so if I want to be refreshed, I could go for a walk. I could splash water on my face. This is stuff that's in my control. So we have control over our emotional lives, and we forget that, and our brains override because we go into fear brain, and good improvisers cannot work out of fear. So I want to talk to you now a little bit about what we did with the Second Science Project when we explored the idea of yes and. So one of the first things they said was, teach us one of your most popular exercises. So we led them through the yes and exercise. And in that exercise, we have people like plot a anniversary event or a reunion event, and one person pitches and the other person just says no to every idea. Then we have them switch places. One person pitches and the other says yes, but. And to us, yes, but is no with a bow tie. It's a passive aggressive no. Or passive aggressive yes. And then the final leg of it is when both parties yes and that's always more interesting, more fun. We're having parties on the moon. So the professors, the scholars in the room were like, great, there's plenty of research as to why yes and makes sense. The chief among them is in behavioral economics, we know that people's default setting is either to say no or to do nothing. So yes and is essentially a nudge to get out of that kind of behavior. But then the question became, what if we truly disagree? What if there's something that we just don't philosophically, morally, ethically agree with the person across from us, but we need to stay in conversation with them? So I hope this is going to resonate with you, given where we are in our public and political conversations, because people are not staying in conversation, and in part because they don't know how. And so the scholars went away and they did some research, and then we went away and practiced some different exercises. And what we came up with is this idea, thank you because. So if I'm having a conversation with someone and I disagree with their point, rather than launching into no, I thank them. So I say thank you. That sets off the gratitude part of the brain, both in them and me. And then the next part is crucial, the because. I find some point of agreement, something that I understand and can respect in the thing that they just offered. I often use the idea of talking to someone who's anti-vaccine. And if I'm talking to them, even though I really don't agree with it, especially now, what I can say is, What I do understand is you love your children so much that you want to protect them. That is exactly what I want to do. That is a point of agreement. That will allow us to stay inside this conversation. This has been a profound exercise for people because it allows them to figure out how to talk through difference. And this is a problem right now, and I think it's going to increasingly become a problem in our virtual spaces. We need to be thinking about more inclusion, more diversity, and empathize for people who maybe don't have the kind of connectivity that we have, that we're able to talk each other like this. There's another exercise that we created called Universal Unique. And this is based on the literature of Nick Epley, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. And he found that people wildly underestimate how much information other people want from them, their personal details, that people actually care about it, but we think they don't. So in this exercise, we pick up banal subject matter like grocery shopping. And we have person A describe to person B universally how people grocery shop. They do that for like a minute. It's usually pretty boring. Then we have them reflect for a moment on how they grocery shop, and they tell the person how they grocery shop. What happens then is these quirky little details come out that people find funny. And you know, a comedy is very much grounded in truth. That is a revelation of truth. And so they're experiencing these truths with the other person. And they're revealing things about them. And they find that really that we're quicker to bond, we're quicker to trust, we know more about each other. And I think you've probably all experienced the studies, the various studies that, you know, if a gay couple moves in next to a homophobe, it's usually about 3 months or so when that person changes their point of view on homosexuality, because they've had this experience of seeing another person as human, as a person. And one of my favorite little pieces of literature that came out in our work at Second Science Project was this the deeper understanding of self. So there's a thing called self-verification theory. And I think most of us think that we want to be seen as our best selves, our prettiest selves, our smartest selves. That's actually not true. We want to be seen as we see ourselves. So if I am clumsy, I need you to see me as clumsy so you don't throw me a ball. But I'm a human being, and I'm probably not going to tell you that. I might not even know it about myself. So the only way we can get to know people is by asking a lot of questions, by really deeply communicating. And yes, those first few questions might not reveal anything, but they eventually will. We are living in a world where people just want to block, and they don't want to communicate. They don't want to understand. They want to assume the worst. A phrase I love is replace blame with curiosity. If you can take a moment to try to talk to someone who maybe thinks differently than you and stay inside that conversation, do the thank you because, then you have an opportunity to learn maybe amazing things, and you might be able to actually bridge a divide. Okay, I'm gonna tell you a quick story, and then I'm gonna wrap up. And I'm happy to take some questions and answer them. I'll tell you one quick Tina Fey story because she's one of my favorite people in the world, and I loved working with her. When Tina Fey was at Second City in the 90s, no one knew who she was. People weren't coming to see Tina Fey. They came to see Rachel Dratch. Rachel Dratch was a star in Chicago at that time. And we all assumed she'd get hired by Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live comes every year to Second City. But instead, Tina got hired as a writer. And then Rachel auditioned, flew out to New York, and then didn't get hired. So at that time, if you didn't get hired for SNL, you had no chance of getting hired again. They kind of made up their mind. I don't know that it's the same now, but it was back then. So Tina, after just being there for 1 year, took over the head writing position from Adam McKay, also a Second City alum. And she really wanted Rachel, and she knew how good she was and wanted her to be in the cast. So she called me up and said, hey, this summer, can I do a show with Rachel in one of the side spaces? I'm like, of course, it'd be great. And what Tina knew is that Lorne Michaels, the producer of Saturday Night Live, would fly out to Chicago every summer. And if he came out to see the regular shows and Tina was doing a show, he would have to see Tina. She's his new head writer. And then, oh, he's going to see Rachel. So lo and behold, they put up this amazing show. Lorne comes out, sees them, hires Rachel Dratch on the spot. So we have a phrase in our work that you have to have each other's back. And literally before we go on stage or before we do a workshop, we pat each other on the back and say, got your back. That is a classic Tina Fey move, having her ensemble members back. I'm going to give you a final phrase that I really love that I think is important to remember right now. So we have a phrase in our work, play the scene you're in, not the scene you want to be in. It is so easy to catastrophize the future or to ruminate the past, but you can't work well while doing that. You want to stay fiercely in the moment, in the now, play the scene you're in. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Kelly. So we have a couple of questions here. First one, is there anything you'd recommend for teams to practice communication while we're all remote and virtual?
Yeah, we have to practice because this stuff is not easy and people talk over each other. So a few different things. I'll actually give you one exercise. We have an exercise called one word story where we tell a story one word at a time. So that's about building a conversation. It is often hard and it requires actual listening. That would be something you can try out. Another one we have is called last word. And so if we're having a conversation and I need to respond to you, I have to respond to you using the last word you said as my first word. All right, so most people check out of conversations midway through, but when you're improvising a scene, you could never do that because the last few sentences could have amazing information, but we just don't do that as human beings. So tricking ourselves or practicing what it's like, because that's going to mean there's going to be some silence, and that's okay because that means you're actually considering what the person said. I think people find that powerful.
Yeah, and I think we all get fearful of silence and having that empty space.
We do, but but you can, believe me, this is what we know from our theater background. Those silent moments, and think about this when you watch great comedy, it's like those takes are the best stuff. It's that moment where you can see someone thinking or understanding, and there's great power in silence.
Perfect. Well, here's another one. As a manager, how can I encourage open communication while still giving critical feedback? Maybe managing up to a boss.
Yeah, okay, a few different things. One, Amy Edmondson, the Harvard professor, talks about the need for psychological safety in teams, which means that people have to have the freedom to make mistakes and report them back. We have a phrase in improvisation called make mistakes work for you. We've also partnered with Kim Scott, who wrote the great book, Radical Candor. That is an excellent book about feedback, but you have to practice radical candor. And that's a collaboration that we're working on, which is how we can, and her idea very simply is that you can only use radical candor with someone if they know that they care for you personally. Otherwise, it's called obnoxious aggression, and that's no good. But there's all these things on the spectrum, right? All the stuff is on the spectrum. So she talks in her grid that you can fall into manipulative insincerity, or the thing that I did as a boss often, which was ruinous empathy, where I care so much I don't say a word. And that is no good. So yeah, the tough conversations are important, and the way you have them is by building an actual relationship of trust and care with your employees. The empathetic, the good thing to do is to have the tough conversation. We also, and Nick Epley's work at the University of Chicago also covers this, which is we also way overestimate how bad those conversations are going to be. I think anyone knows this, like the amount of fretting you do about almost any conversation never meets what the conversation actually happened. So you should remind yourself about that.
Excellent, thank you. And I have one last one here to close off. What is the biggest change you've seen in an organization because of Yes And? You mentioned Radical Candor. What other books besides that do you recommend also?
A really great book for right now is called You're It, and it's a group of Harvard professors. Eric McNulty is one of them, and it's all about crisis management and based all on evidence and research. And they study things like the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing. And McNulty actually went in to meet with the group and sort of said, all right, so who is in charge? No one. There was not one person in charge. Everyone was in charge of their area. They communicated effectively. Now, they had an advantage being in Boston because there's so many historical events for so many years that they've had to have sort of crisis planning and practice, and they've been doing that, so they all just moved into that, and it was sort of seamless communication and collaboration, and that when that's not available to you, and I think we're seeing that the effects of that right now in different parts of the country, you're toast. And this book was one of these things that I read it, and I was just finding gem after gem after gem. And it's not hyperbole. Everything in there is highly researched. So that's my recommendation.
Awesome, thank you. And actually we have one more that just came through. What is the best and easiest way for me to start creating change and do this today?
Oh, that is a great question. You know what you need to do is you got to declare it out loud. We forget the power of saying the thing. I have a friend, Allison Wood Brooks, who's a Harvard professor. And when I was out giving talks, you know, I get nervous like anyone will. It doesn't even matter how long you're doing it. And she specifically said, I give you a technique. Instead of saying you're nervous, say you're excited out loud. And what you're doing is you're changing this to good stress from bad stress by saying it out loud. And there's actually a bunch of research around saying the words. So I think step number one is sort of declaring the thing that you want or you believe in, getting other people on board with that, and then recognize like none of this changes without skills practice. It's not enough to sort of declare it and then like that's like thinking that professional athletes or musicians just scrimmage or just play the concerto. No, they do scales. They throw balls around. It's skills building. That's what improv is. Improv is about tuning your listening, tuning your communication, building your resilience. It's all these different muscles that then you put into play when you go into the world in these real world situations. But everyone goes to like role playing and scrimmaging and it's like, no, you don't have the skills yet. Build up the muscles. This stuff ain't easy.
I think that's a really important takeaway I know for myself as well.
Mm.
Excellent. Well, we will wrap up. Just thank you so much, Kelly, for being part of the program today.
You.
It was very insightful to kind of dive into improv and how that drives change. I know my aha moment really was, you know, how to drive a growth set with the yes and concept. And I think the quote, my takeaway is how to affirm and contribute to explore and heighten, which is really great. And also on a side note, I mean, watching that video clip, just seeing how spoiled we are with HD TV right now.
Yes, very much.
And also just to thank you again to Christian. You know, something that stuck out for me in that particular session, you know, was that when we're forced to change one belief, we really have the freedom to question all other beliefs. And, you know, that's a mantra that really connects with me, both professionally and personally. So just to wrap things up, I just want to say we really appreciate everyone for joining us today. An extra special thanks to Jai for capturing the essence of the session and creating the first piece of the paradigm shift puzzle. SketchFX will be joining us each week. So once that is wrapped up, at the end of the 5 weeks, Jai will be putting these together and we'll share that with you all post-event so you can see that common red thread throughout. To close out, just to invite you all to join us again back next week as we continue with the next chapter of Paradigm Shift, which is the debate. We're going to be hosting 3 really exciting panels. We have some great speakers from IBM, also from TCS, some of our partners, as well as the the National Retail Foundation, sorry. And also, just to tell you a little bit more about those sessions, the discussions are going to include zeroing in on how the definition of digitization has found a new meaning, a new sense of urgency as well, whether there's a silver lining of the crisis, and which is a newfound path towards true sustainability, and also how our supply chains are forever altered by the disruption, and then also how we need to rebuild and recover moving forward. I also want to invite every one of you to invite any friends or colleagues or folks in your network that you think might enjoy the upcoming week's sessions. And also we're going to have the recording available for you post-event, which we'll send out to you very shortly so you can share if you so choose. I wish you all a very wonderful week. I hope you and your family stay safe, and I really look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday, same time, same place. Bye for now, everybody. Take care.